This is the Christmas season and the Thanksgiving season, and I thought we would talk a bit in tribute to Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln was shot at Ford Theater, he was taken across the street after the shooting to a rooming house and put into a bed, which of course was much smaller than his adequate frame at 6'4" could accommodate. He lingered through the evening. He was essentially moribund from the moment he was shot. When he died in early morning, I think about 7 o'clock in the morning, Secretary of State Seward, said he now belongs to the ages. Abraham Lincoln was the 16th President of the United States. I think we are now at 44. When we rank our presidents, and we do as Americans, nobody ever puts Abraham Lincoln below the first or the second. He certainly would be next to George Washington, perhaps indeed even head of George Washington. We do not have in this country a pantheon. For those who might not be familiar with that word, it's a Greek word meaning hall of heroes. We don't have such a thing. They have them in Germany, in France, in England, and most of the other countries in Europe, but we do not. The closest we come to a pantheon is the mall area of Washington, D.C., where we have the Washington Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, and the Lincoln Memorial. Those memorials came about over a long period of time. I believe the Washington Memorial was started in the 1840s and perhaps finished just after the Civil War. The Lincoln Memorial was started, I think, about 1890 and was finished, I think, maybe about 1922. And the Jefferson Memorial was started even later. I don't think was finished until the 1940s. Lincoln was an unusual human being. Somebody once said that he was strong but not willful, that he was moral but not moralistic. Those are compliments that probably do not apply to very many human beings. The country that we know today, the United States of America, developed out of the cauldron of the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, we had, I think, the census of 1860. The population of the United States was about 31 million people. The population today of the United States is something in excess of 300 million people. In 1860, we were really a small, localized economy and a country without a great deal of worldwide influence. Today, we are probably, if anybody can give us that designation other than ourselves, the strongest nation with the largest economy on this planet. Abraham Lincoln had a great deal to do with that. Now, when I say he was an unusual human being, I mean that precisely. He had confidence in himself. He had very little formal education. Some have said as little as 2 years. He was very much interested in his own genealogy. In fact, he said to somebody not too long before his death that he wanted to visit England. He understood that his ancestors were from England. And I've looked into it a little bit, and I don't know that I can be any more precise than he, because he wasn't quite precise. But his family originally came from an area northeast of London, in Norwich, which is in East Anglia. All of you who have been familiar with watching World War II movies where you see the US 8th Air Force taking off and bombing raids for Germany, most of them came out of that section, northeast of London. The first Lincolns came into Massachusetts as early as 1678. I read a book not long ago describing the various migrations of people from England to the United States and putting them into 3 categories. One category was that group of people from the north and northeast of England, such as Lincoln's family, who settled in Massachusetts and became what you would refer to as Puritans. You may remember the movie Scarlet Letter, or the book rather, Scarlet Letter. The other group of people that came in the United States were the people who were part of the aristocratic part of the England that settled in Virginia, that became part of the aristocratic section of Virginia. The third one was that group of people we frequently refer to as Scotch-Irish. That's a term that's not used anywhere in the world except here. If you mention the word Scotch-Irish to the Scots or the Irish, they wouldn't have a clue what you're talking about. But after James I in 1603, a lot of the Scots were moved into the northeast portion of Scotland, Ireland, which we now call Ulster. When they migrated thereafter to the United States, they were called Scotch-Irish. Now, Lincoln's family moved from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania, and they, like the Scotch-Irish, followed the migration that was allowed by the geography of that area. The mountains run from the northeast to the southwest, and almost all of them got into that migration going down the Shenandoah Valley, which essentially starts at Harper's Ferry and ends at Lookout Mountain in Chattanooga. Many of them made a right-hand turn at a place called Cumberland Gap. After the Lincoln family moved from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania, they also moved into the Shenandoah Valley, eventually into Kentucky, settling in south-central Kentucky near Hodgensville. Perhaps some of you have been there. He became president of the United States, no doubt, based upon the mythology, because he was born in a log cabin. Some of us who might wish and aspire to be president, to exceed that would have to be spawned in a ditch or hatched under a cabbage leaf or something. But he was indeed born in a log cabin, and oddly enough, his opponent in the Civil War, Jefferson Davis, was born about 100 miles further south and further west, near a little town called Elkton. The Confederacy doesn't have a pantheon either. There is an avenue in Richmond, Virginia called, I believe, the Avenue of the, I can't exactly remember what the title is, but there are statues there of Lee and Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart and Davis. Davis himself, there is a monument in southwestern Kentucky that sits out in the middle of the countryside where Jefferson Davis was born. As I say, it was about 100 miles from where Lincoln was in fact born. The history of Lincoln thereafter, you all know at least as well as I. His mother died while he was an infant, or not an infant, but a young man. She had an awful lot of intellectual curiosity, and she passed that intellectual curiosity off to her son. His father moved the family to Indiana, southern Indiana. Kentucky then and now still has a lot of boundary problems and the disputes over land sizes and dimensions. There was a stepmother. He was very fond of his stepmother. She also apparently had a lot of intellectual curiosity and stimulated him to read. They then moved on to Illinois. Very few people can claim a contribution to the success and development of this country to the extent of Abraham Lincoln. He was president for 4 years and 4 weeks. He died in April of 1865. I've reflected upon some of the things that he might have thought about giving the timing. We are now at the Thanksgiving Christmas holiday of 2013. 150 years ago precisely, even on this date, Lincoln was just a few days from Christmas. Abraham Lincoln spent 4 Christmases, 4 Thanksgiving Christmas holidays in the White House. The first one was in 1861. If you look back on what occurred just prior to that Thanksgiving period. The South had had won the first battle against the North at the Battle of Bull Run. The efforts of the North to try to do something to keep the South from seceding had been a failure. Lincoln had been attempting everything he could to keep the border states, Kentucky, and Maryland, and Missouri, from seceding and joining the South. Lincoln once said that he would like to have God on his side, but he must have Kentucky. He didn't have a great deal to be joyful about at his Thanksgiving Christmas of 1861. The second Thanksgiving Christmas holiday he had was in 1862, of course. It had very little to be successful, to be proud of there, at least militarily. By the spring of 1862, at the Battle of Shiloh, it became apparent that the South would fight to the death. Up to that point, Lincoln had tried everything he could to keep the South from leaving and to try to get them to come back. He made it apparent that his role as president was to preserve the Union. It was not at that point to abolish slavery. But once the casualties came in, at the level they came in, particularly at the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862, it was clear that the war would only end when one was defeated and exhausted. The campaign thereafter on the peninsula was even a worse disaster under McClellan, followed by perhaps the most tactical, brilliant victory of the entire Civil War at the Second Battle of Bull Run. On the other hand, on the domestic side, 1862 was a great victory for Abraham Lincoln. He passed the Homestead Act of 1862, which allowed people to farm in 160 acres if they could show that they could farm it. Nothing has ever contributed more to the development of the middle class than the Homestead Act of 1862. He got passed the Morrill Act, which set up all of the land grant colleges in this country. If you went to Eastern Michigan, or Western Michigan, or Michigan State, or Northern Michigan, you went to a school that was created in large part because of Abraham Lincoln. He believed in education. He had little himself, but he understood that if you had a chance to succeed, you needed it. He passed a bill that provided for railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad, which wasn't finished until 1868, 3 years after his death, was passed in 1862. He did it in some part, not just because he thought it was the right thing to do, but he was concerned that if we didn't do something to tie the West Coast to the East Coast, that the West Coast might secede too. He adopted a national bank, which had been discontinued under the Jackson administration 30 years earlier. He established greenbacks. He rebuilt the Capitol. He would be mesmerized by a position that's being advanced now, that government is not the solution, government is the problem. Lincoln would not comprehend that statement. In 1863, it was even worse for him, in a way. Yes, the Union had won the Battle of Vicksburg, and they had won the Battle of Gettysburg, the subject about which Ron Lowe and I spoke the last time I was here. But again, they had not been decisive victories. The South still had an army in the field under Lee, and nobody really thought that they could beat Lee on even terms. It wasn't a good year for him. On top of that, earlier on, his son had died while they were in the White House. I think Lincoln was the first family that had young children in the White House. He had a son that died of typhoid, I believe, in February of 1862. His wife, who was a great promoter of his, wanted him to be President of the United States, had a lot of emotional baggage. That's as polite a term as I could put to it. But she never really recovered after her son died in the White House. And she was somewhat abusive, so the story goes, of Lincoln himself. He was very generous with himself. Of all the reading I've done of Abraham Lincoln, I have never come across one single word that ever suggested that while he was President of the United States, he took a vacation. He took some trips to visit the troops in the field. He spent his time generously with his family, but primarily he was married to his job, which was to preserve the Union. 1864 was even another crisis for him. So when he went through the holiday of Thanksgiving and Christmas of 1864, he had to look at a situation where he still was not certain that he had a general in the field that could compete with the Southern commanders. He did have, but he didn't know it early on. He had Grant. But Grant was a slug master. He knew that to beat the South, you had to beat the Southern armies. And that the only way you could defeat the Southern armies was to hit them head on and hit them hard. And the battles in 1864 of the Wilderness, and Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, and eventually Petersburg, were battles where the South lost as many as 4 and 5 times as many casualties as did the South. On top of that, 1864 was a year that was unusual for Lincoln. He was up for re-election. Can you imagine having an election in the midst of a civil war? It would have been easy for him to dispense with that prerequisite, probably. He had dispensed with the writ of habeas corpus. He had established himself as being the person in control. He probably could have managed to avoid having an election. But he had an election anyway, because if there's one thing that was true about Abraham Lincoln, he understood and believed in the concept of democracy. And he knew that his strength and his ability to persevere in terms of what he wanted to accomplish would be based upon the support of the citizenry. So in the midst of the Civil War, in the fall of 1864, he had an election, which he thought that he would lose. But oddly enough, he won dramatically. In the election of 1860, he was a minority president. There were a multiplicity of candidates. He did win, he got a plurality, but he got fewer votes than half. In 1864, however, he won dramatically with a substantial majority, not just a plurality. And a big part of that plurality came from the soldiers who voted, who were in the Army of the Northern, of the Potomac. And one of his opponent in the election of 1864 was none other than McClellan, who had been the Union general of that same army in 1862 before Lincoln finally cashiered him. Now, there's little that you could say that would be more dramatic than to say that of 44 presidents, Lincoln comes in as perhaps the most dramatic and the most successful. I believe that his contribution is probably unmeasured by a lot of the citizenry of this country. We tend to forget the contribution of some of our leaders. There seems to be a philosophy in this country now that nothing in politics is positive. I don't believe that. I think that's wrong. And I think the only solution we have is to work through those politicians. But I've thought about what Lincoln has done or said that might be of an advantage to us as citizens of this country today. In his first inaugural address in March of 1861, it was a typical lawyer-like presentation. He was giving both the opening argument and the closing argument as if he were in a jury trial. And he begged the American public, particularly the people of the South, not to secede, to pay attention and pay homage to the Union. And he finished up by suggesting that all of the citizenry should appeal to the better angels of their nature. Now, when I studied English in undergraduate school, as Mr. Ryan suggested I had a little background in, they taught you a literary device called imagery, the better angels of your nature. Now, Mr. Lincoln didn't tell us who the poorer angels are or the darker angels, but it might be greed or avarice or ego or all kinds of other things. He didn't even tell us what the better angels are. But when you go to evaluate your politicians today and the subjects that are currently of interest to us as citizens of this country, you might look at it and decide whether your politicians in your behalf in a Republican form of government are operating under Lincoln's proposition of appealing to the better angels of their nature. In the Gettysburg Address, which I have spoken to this club about at least on one occasion, it was a prayer. It was short. It only took 3 or 4 minutes. It was less than 300 words. It started out by saying 407 years ago, which was a biblical reference. But it was a prayer. And it ended up with the phrase, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. He was expressing his confidence in the concept of democratic government. When this country started, it was a question as to whether the people could in fact govern themselves. It was called an experiment. And there are some today that suggest that that experiment is still going on. But Lincoln suggested in the Gettysburg Address that we must have government of the people, by the people, and for the people. What does that mean? It means government by a majority. So again, as citizens of this country, when you evaluate your politicians and you look at the subjects, ask yourself whether those politicians and those subjects are trying to achieve that objective of government by the majority. In Lincoln's last inaugural address, or second inaugural address, in March of 1864, it was like a confessional. He apologized to whomever was listening for the sins of this country in terms of slavery. And then he said, we need to have no evil to anybody and charity to all. That's not exactly the phrase, but it was very close to that. Again, if you applied that same standard, I think we would probably end up with a better country today. Now, I came in today planning to talk to you a great deal more, but I've had a little difficulty with my vision lately, and so I'm totally outside of any notes, and whatever I've had to say has been entirely by memory. And if somebody wants to ask questions, I'd be perfectly willing to do that, but at this point, the appropriate thing to do would be to hand the phone back to Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan.
I do have a question, John. John, I'll start, and while others might be gathering their questions. Lincoln once said, America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we've destroyed ourselves. Is there anything in your view that would give you pause and thought about faltering and losing our freedoms today?
That goes to the question of what democracy is. Democracy is government by the majority. In the simplest definition, that is half plus one. One of the big problems we have today is that even in our presidential elections, where our turnout is the highest, only 60% of the people who can vote, vote. We also put restrictions on ourselves in terms of our ability to debate subjects. We want to be polite. We don't want to be contentious. We avoid things that are contentious. We also, therefore, avoid discussing the subjects. I still think that democracy is going to succeed, but it can only succeed if we as citizens follow perhaps Lincoln's advice, and we all participate, and we all get involved, and we make our politicians be responsive. We have situations that are structurally within our government that are undemocratic. For example, out of 435 House of Representative districts, it is estimated that less than 10% are actually competitive. They're all structured and gerrymandered. It's not gerrymander, it's gerrymander. If you took, for example, in the federal House of Representatives today, out of 435, I think the Republican Party has something like 238, and the balance of the Democrats. But if you added up all the people that live in the 238 districts that the Republicans control today, it's less than 40% of the total public of the United States, population of the United States. Why? Because those districts are gerrymandered. When you talk about the filibuster in the United States Senate, what you're talking about is giving minority not just the ability to exercise minority rights, you're talking about a situation where the minority literally can control what occurs. We have structural, systemic issues in our government that's making it difficult for us to operate as a democracy. We have evolved as a democracy. In 1787, women couldn't vote. Blacks couldn't vote. If you didn't own property, you couldn't vote. Over a period of time, these things have changed, but there are still problems. A lot of these bills that are being passed in the state legislatures restricting the right to vote, or when you can vote, the frequency of voting, and so forth, in my opinion, without trying to be partisan, are essentially restricting the ability of the majority to govern the country.
Any other questions? When I think of this is Lincoln, John, I think of a commercial, a modern commercial, and it's a black and white commercial. I think it's for Geico Insurance, and many of you have seen it. Mrs. Lincoln walks into the room, and she's got one of those very large dresses, and she says to President Lincoln, "Does this dress make me look big?" And of course, he's very, very quiet, looking around and not saying anything, and it's uncomfortable silence. And then he says, "Well, maybe a little," and she storms out of the room. And I always think that that's a hilarious commercial. Who had a question over here? Bill?
In your value opinion.
In my what opinion?
Your value, very value. Do you think that Lincoln looked at slavery as an economic issue or as a moral issue?
He looked at it as a moral issue. He was a pragmatist. When the war started, he always thought that slavery was wrong. But he took the position that slavery could continue to exist where it existed. It couldn't be expanded into the new territories. You see, you have to understand what happened. In 1787, we were a small country essentially in the East Coast of the United States. Jefferson came along in 1803. He had an opportunity because of things that happened in Haiti to buy what is referred to as the Louisiana Purchase. When he did, the size of the United States doubled. When it doubled, that territory, the question became, will it be free or slave? The Southerners wanted it to be slave. So you had a number of compromises put together by people who were compromising. Clay from Kentucky, Webster from Massachusetts, even John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. And you had the Compromise of 1820, which said something like you could have slavery south of 3630, but not north of. Then you had the Compromise of 1850, in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, all of which went to the issue of whether those new territories can be slave or non-slave. The South wanted them to be slave because, if for no other reason, for every state that was admitted it was slave, you'd have 2 more Southern senators. Then you had the Mexican War of 1848, which many people refer to as a Southerners' War. The South wanted that war because we got California and New Mexico and Arizona, and the question was, will they be slave or free? No, it was a moral issue, and by 1863, he had changed. If you read the background of the Emancipation Proclamation, which I spoke to this club about one time, he had reached that conclusion where it had to occur. And so when the Emancipation Proclamation came down in January 1st of 1863, the cause of the war was slavery. And when you read the second inaugural address, it's clear that he had gotten to that point. It was a moral issue. And it's, oddly enough, it's not just that we today look at Lincoln as the best. Prior presidents have too. I'm in the process of reading a book now called The Bully Pulpit about Teddy Roosevelt. When Teddy Roosevelt left office in March of 1909, just before he left, he took a train trip to Hodgensville, Kentucky. He considered Lincoln his mentor, his guidance. And he said to a reporter, whose name I've since forgotten, "Why are you leaving office?" He says, "Well, I said I would. I wouldn't run more than one time," because he essentially served 2 terms. But he said, the moral issues is what I took care of. But now we're down to economic issues, and somebody else can handle that. Lincoln handled moral issues. Somebody asked me one time, I don't know whether it was at this club or someplace else I spoke, whether if Lincoln looked at the situation, let's say in 1863, and he saw all these massive casualties, and a war that looked like it wasn't going to end, whether he would have backed off. And I thought about it, and I said, I don't think so. I think he would have stuck to his guns. He was moral without being moralistic. I don't think anybody can give anybody a greater compliment than that.
Thank you, John.